Mara's 64th birthday began like most others in recent years, quiet, solitary, and touched with a familiar ache, the kind that lingers not from pain, but from absence. Her home, once filled with conversation, the hum of shared meals, and the soft baritone of her husband's laughter, now echoed only with the gentle creak of wood and the whistle of the morning kettle. She didn't expect much, just a call from her sister, maybe a visit from her neighbor Evelyn, and the quiet company of her cat, Jasper. But when she opened the mailbox that afternoon, nestled between an electric bill and a gardening catalog, was an envelope with no return address, cream-colored, slightly worn at the edges. Her name written in a hand she hadn't seen in 2 decades. Her breath caught. With trembling fingers, Mara opened it. Inside, a simple birthday card, blue hydrangeas, her favorite flower, pressed faintly against a faded sky. And one line, handwritten in the unmistakable cursive of Thomas, her husband who had vanished without a trace 20 years earlier. "Happy birthday, Mara. I never left. Look in the basement." The words were a thunderclap. Her first reaction was disbelief. Some cruel prank, perhaps. Then came the skepticism. Could someone have forged his handwriting? But no. No one could mimic that uneven R, the loop in his F. She had memorized every stroke in the early months after his disappearance, clinging to the last grocery list he'd written as if it were sacred text. And yet, beneath the fear, the doubts, the dull roar of confusion was something deeper. Hope. The kind of hope she had buried in the years after the police closed the case. The kind that had whispered at 3 a.m. when she stared at the empty side of the bed. The kind she had forced herself to abandon to stay sane. Mara stood still for a long time, holding the card to her chest like it might vanish. Then, without a word, she walked back inside and looked toward the basement door. The journey had begun not just down a flight of stairs, but into the shadows of the past, the weight of unanswered questions, and the whisper of a truth that refused to stay buried. There was a time when Mara believed she was living the quiet kind of love others envied. She and Ellis had been married for nearly 4 decades. Their life together was never marked by grand gestures or passionate declarations, but by routines that spoke of comfort and familiarity, sharing the crossword on Sunday mornings, folding laundry while humming to the same old radio station, and enjoying evening tea on the porch, watching the seasons shift in silence. Neighbors called them the calm couple, and Mara wore that label like a soft scarf. She thought their stillness was a sign of stability, a testament to enduring affection that didn't need constant reaffirmation. But over time, that stillness became something colder. At first, it was subtle. Ellis, once attentive in his quiet way, began to grow more distracted. His eyes no longer lingered when she spoke. Their conversations shrank from full exchanges to simple confirmations. He began spending more and more time in the basement, originally his workshop, but soon a world she wasn't invited into. When she'd ask what he was working on, he'd brush her off with vague answers, just sorting things, or nothing important. Evenings together became evenings apart. The tea would grow cold on the porch while Mara sat alone, pretending the silence was mutual rather than imposed. She told herself it was age, that men grow quieter with time, that love matures into something less visible. But the quiet began to hurt. The rituals they once shared became hers alone. The crossword sat unfinished, the porch gathered dust, and though they still slept under the same roof, Mara often felt like she lived alone. The house remained tidy, the bills were paid, but something had shifted beneath the surface, something she couldn't yet name. It would be months before Mara discovered the truth behind the basement door. But even before then, her heart had started whispering a question she wasn't ready to ask out loud. Was peace really peace if it came at the cost of being unseen? It didn't happen all at once. That's the thing, with quiet heartbreak it unfolds slowly, almost imperceptibly, until one day, the silence is too loud to ignore. Mara first noticed the shift when Ellis forgot their wedding anniversary for the 2nd year in a row. No flowers, no card, not even the usual rushed dinner reservation. Just a normal day in his eyes. while she sat in the kitchen stirring soup with hands that trembled, unsure whether to remind him or pretend it didn't matter. Later, he began taking walks alone. "Just clearing my head," he'd say, already slipping on his shoes before she could ask to join. Sometimes he came back with the smell of coffee she hadn't tasted or with a faint perfume she didn't recognize. But Mara didn't ask questions. She had learned that asking could feel like begging. Conversations grew shorter. Meals were eaten with eyes on the television instead of each other. And when Mara brought up little things like how the hallway light flickered, or that her back ached from gardening, Ellis nodded absently, offering no response, as if her words were background noise. She began to feel transparent in her own home. What shattered her last remaining illusion wasn't cruelty, but something worse: indifference. At a neighborhood gathering, someone asked Ellis about his wife's hobbies. Without thinking, he laughed and said, "Oh, Mara, she's just the wife, keeps the house in order. Just the wife." The phrase sliced through her like glass clean, sharp and dismissive. Mara had spent decades being his confidant, his cheerleader, his partner in every sense. She had stood beside him through career changes, family deaths, and sleepless nights with sick children. And now, to be reduced to just the wife was like erasing an entire lifetime of devotion. She didn't say anything at the time, just smiled politely, excused herself to the kitchen, and let the hum of the dishwasher drown out the sting behind her eyes. That night, lying beside a man who now seemed like a distant relative, Mara stared at the ceiling and understood something she hadn't dared admit before. Love can fade not only through conflict, but through neglect. And perhaps, the loneliest feeling of all is not being hated but being slowly forgotten. It was an ordinary summer morning. The sun spilled gently across the kitchen floor as Mara set out Ellis's usual breakfast toast with marmalade and a single soft-boiled egg. He came down the stairs with his signature quiet grace, kissed her on the forehead, and said, "I'm just popping out to get some milk." She didn't think twice. He always liked his coffee with just a splash of milk, and the carton had run out the night before. But Ellis never returned. An hour passed. Then 2. By evening, Mara's unease had grown into full-blown panic. She called his phone. It rang endlessly, then went silent. By nightfall, she'd called the police. 3 days later, his car was found abandoned near the edge of the river outside town. Inside were his wallet, wedding band, and cell phone, carefully arranged on the passenger seat. A jacket draped over the steering wheel, the keys still in the ignition. There was no note, no message, just absence. The authorities concluded what seemed most plausible: suicide, a sudden, tragic decision. "No body," the officer had said gently, "but sometimes the river doesn't return what it takes." The search was called off a week later. Mara stood at the riverbank for hours after the police left, staring into the rushing current as if it might return him like driftwood. She organized a small memorial service at the chapel, placing a framed photograph of Ellis at the front, the one where he's smiling at their anniversary dinner, eyes soft and warm. Friends came, offered condolences, held her hand. But no one could answer the question that clawed at her chest every night. Why didn't he say goodbye? Years passed. Mara learned to live with the grief, a quiet companion that moved into the corners of her life. She didn't remarry. She didn't relocate. The house stayed the same, except for the dusty attic and one unused drawer in their bedroom left untouched, filled with the last shirt Ellis ever wore. She told herself he must have been suffering silently, that maybe, just maybe, he believed disappearing was the kinder way. But beneath her sorrow, buried deep and never voiced aloud, a small part of her had always whispered the unthinkable. What if he chose to vanish, not out of despair, but out of something else entirely? And what if, all these years, he'd been alive, just living another life? The invitation had arrived 3 days early. An elegant cream envelope slipped beneath the door like a whisper. No return address, only Mara's name in a handwriting she hadn't seen in decades. Inside, a single line: "For what you never dared to ask." That night, after hours of pacing, Mara descended into the basement. It had always been Ellis's domain, A place of shelves stacked with faded books, dusty jars of screws, and the smell of turpentine sealed into the wooden walls. She hadn't come down here much since he vanished. Not since the police told her they had found his watch by the cliffs. But tonight, something pulled her deeper. Behind an old water heater, partially concealed by a broken shutter, was a section of the wall that didn't quite match. She ran her fingers along the seam. It shifted. A hidden door. With trembling hands, she pushed it open. Inside was a narrow, dimly lit alcove. And in the center, a weathered wooden box. She lifted the lid, slow, expecting, perhaps memories or guilt. But what she found was a different kind of betrayal. Documents, certificates, photos. There was Ellis, standing beside another woman, smiling too comfortably for it to be recent. Another photo, Ellis again, older, arms around two teenage boys who looked unmistakably like him. One wore a college hoodie from a state they'd never visited, a lease agreement, a bank account under a different name, a marriage certificate dated 3 years after he was presumed dead. Mara sat on the cold concrete floor, the box beside her, as the truth settled in like dust. Ellis had not died. He had disappeared on purpose. He'd started over, with a new name, a new family, a new life, all while she grieved, mourned, questioned what she'd done wrong. All while the neighbors pitied her, while she paid off debts left in his name and carried the silence like a widow's shroud. He hadn't just left. He had erased her. Mara didn't cry, not yet. The pain sat beneath her ribs like an anchor. But in that moment, it wasn't just heartbreak, she felt it was clarity. What she had believed to be abandonment by death was, in fact, rejection by choice. And now, with that truth in her hands, she was no longer the woman who waited. She was the woman who had finally seen everything clearly. Mara didn't scream. She didn't break dishes or write long letters of accusation. That wasn't her way. Her silence wasn't surrender, it was calculation. When the truth first began to crack through the surface, she moved with the same quiet grace that had carried her through decades of disappointment. But this time, her steps were deliberate, private, empowered. She hired a discreet investigator not to cause scandal, but to gather clarity, to understand, in full, what had been taken from her not only emotionally, but legally. She didn't want revenge. She wanted the truth to have its day in the light. With the documents collected, financial records, forged signatures, transactions done behind her back, Mara began working with a legal advisor she trusted. She didn't tell a soul. There were no dramatic announcements. Just a woman, steadily reclaiming her life, inch by inch, with dignity. At home, she began to write again, not the grocery lists or passive diary entries of before, but pages filled with honest reflection. She wrote not for anyone else, but to rediscover her own voice, one that had been drowned in years of compliance and quiet tears. Each morning, she sat by the window with a cup of tea and her journal, and told herself the truth. She changed her daily rhythms, too. Long walks replaced anxious waiting. Her meals became rituals of nourishment, not hurried obligations. She played music she hadn't listened to in years, songs that reminded her of the version of herself before she was taken for granted. And slowly, something inside her shifted. Her spine straightened when she walked into rooms. Her gaze met others without hesitation. When people asked how she was, she no longer said fine out of habit. She told the truth in fragments, softly, clearly. Mara didn't raise her voice, she raised her standards. The woman who once whispered her needs now moved through life with a quiet, commanding clarity. Not bitter, not vengeful, just done with being small for the comfort of others. This wasn't about winning. It was about returning to herself. And in that return, there was power. When Ellis tried to reach out to their daughter through a carefully worded email, disguised as curiosity, Mara didn't hesitate. She penned a single-page letter, hand-signed and delivered by certified mail, with a clear message: do not contact her again. She is not yours to reclaim. For a week, there was silence. Then a message came. Ellis wanted to talk, just once. No expectations, just a conversation in public. Mara agreed, but not out of nostalgia or hope. She chose the park, not far from where their daughter had learned to ride a bike under her care alone. The air was crisp, early autumn settling gently over the trees. She sat on a bench facing the pond. When Ellis arrived, he looked older than she remembered, but not wiser. He smiled, perhaps expecting a softened version of the woman he had once underestimated. "You look well," he said, as if that could patch the years. Mara didn't smile. "Say what you came to say." He fumbled, searching for words that wouldn't sound like excuses but couldn't find any. "I made mistakes," he said eventually. "Life was complicated." "Life was honest," Mara replied, voice low but firm. "It was your choices that were complicated." Ellis exhaled, trying a gentler route. "I was scared. Of being tied down. Of failing. And so, you abandoned," Mara said flatly. "Not just Mayboot, the truth, the responsibility, the family we were supposed to build together." He looked away. "I didn't think you'd make it without me." "That's the only part you were right about," she said, her gaze steady. "I didn't make it without you. I made it despite you." Ellis swallowed. "Is there any chance of rebuilding something?" Mara shook her head slowly. "I'm not here for closure. I'm not here to fix what you broke. I'm here so you understand that I remember everything and that I am not asking you to feel guilty, just to feel the weight of what you walked away from." A pause. "I forgive you," she said at last. "But forgiveness doesn't reopen doors. It closes them with grace." Ellis looked at her, stunned into silence. Mara stood, calm and composed. "I forgive, but I will never forget. And I won't let you rewrite the past just because the present feels empty." Then she walked away. And this time, he didn't follow. Justice doesn't always arrive with sirens or courtroom drama. Sometimes it comes quietly, carried in an envelope sealed by truth. When the envelope arrived at Mara's new residenza, modest apartment with sunlight pooling across her wooden floors, she opened it with steady hands. The lawyer's letter confirmed what her instincts had long suspected. Ellis had committed bigamy. The evidence was clear. 2 active marriage certificates, one in Vermont and one in Colorado. 2 lives, 2 lies, stitched together with fraud and arrogance. She didn't react with outrage. No tears, no yelling. Just a long exhale as if her lungs, for the first time in months, had room to breathe again. Mara didn't seek revenge. She didn't file criminal charges. That wasn't her purpose. Instead, she requested a legal annulment of the second marriage, and through her attorney, she asked for a formal acknowledgement of the bigamy in court records, not for spectacle, but for clarity, for truth, for the dignity of her own name. Ellis, when served the documents, was reportedly stunned, not because he didn't expect consequences, but because he never expected Mara to find her voice or use it so precisely. Soon, the dominoes began to fall. His second wife, Emily, who had no idea she was part of a Lee filed for separation. His company, which boasted a squeaky clean image, quietly asked for his resignation to avoid reputational damage. Mutual friends, once charmed by his wit, began to back away, not with anger, but with disappointment, the kind that doesn't need to shout to be felt. Mara, meanwhile, remained distant from the wreckage, not hiding, just choosing peace over spectacle. When asked by a friend if she felt satisfied watching his world crumble, she shook her head. "This isn't satisfaction," she said. "It's closure." Ellis didn't apologize. He sent one terse email, "I never meant to hurt you." Mara didn't reply. Because when someone builds their life on deception, the truth is not a dagger, it's a mirror. And sometimes, the most powerful form of justice is simply letting the reflection speak for itself. The letter arrived in a plain envelope. No return address, no dramatic handwriting, just a simple, typed name at the bottom. Elaine Whitaker, Ellis's second wife. Mara read the opening line twice before continuing. "I owe you an apology," it began. "Not for the betrayal, not for the years of silence, but for believing Ellis's version of the past without ever once reaching out to hear hers." Elaine explained, in crisp, remorseful sentences, that the truth had unraveled gradually through misplaced documents, quiet observations, and Ellis's own inconsistencies. What finally broke her loyalty was the realization that Ellis had treated her not as a partner, but as a second audience for the same old script, one where he was always the victim. She ended the letter with a simple, direct sentence. "I've asked Ellis to leave. I will no longer be a shelter for his half-truths." Mara placed the letter on the table beside her tea and stared out the window of her quiet, sun-filled apartment. She did not smile. She did not gloat. What she felt wasn't victory, it was balance. The kind that arrives slowly, without ceremony, when the truth finally finds its way through. Justice, she realized, had never been about revenge. It was about clarity. And in that moment, Mara understood something powerful. She had already won the day she chose to walk away without bitterness. She looked around her space, once so empty, now filled with signs of leafa blooming pothos in the corner, framed art from women she mentored, stacks of journals where her story now lived on her terms. For years, she had been the woman waiting on phone calls, on explanations, on love, but no longer. She was now the woman who chose where to live, chose who to forgive, chose herself, finally and fully. That was her real ending, or rather, her new beginning. In the soft hush of early evening, Mara sat across from her daughter, a pot of tea warming between them. For the first time in years, there was no tension behind her smile, no hesitation in her words, just truth gently but fully spoken. She shared everything, the overheard conversations, the slow erosion of her place in the family, the moment she realized love had turned into obligation. She spoke not to accuse, but to release. The silence afterward was not awkward, it was sacred. Her daughter listened, really listened, not as someone waiting to respond, but as someone finally seeing. The stories peeled back years of assumption, revealing a woman far more resilient than the fragile image her family had painted. Mara wasn't just a mother or a widow. She was a woman who had once held a family together and then learned to hold herself. "I thought you stayed quiet because you were afraid," her daughter whispered. "I stayed quiet," Mara replied, "because I was watching, because I knew one day someone might finally ask." There was no dramatic apology, no grand reconciliation, just a long, quiet hug that said more than words ever could. In that embrace was recognition, respect, a silent promise that from this moment forward, the story would be written differently. Later that night, Mara knelt beside the fireplace. She opened a worn box filled with old cards and notes, most of them polite, some performative, all masking years of misunderstanding. She held up the last card she'd ever received from her son-in-law, a generic message, unsigned, a symbol of how far the heart can wander when love is transactional. She fed it into the fire. The paper curled, darkened, and vanished in the flames. Not with anger, not with bitterness, but with closure. And then, with no ceremony, Mara climbed the stairs. The basement door creaked open behind Hearth's space where grief had lingered too long. She stepped out into the quiet hallway, the light touching her shoulders like a shawl of possibility. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees. Inside, a woman who had once been forgotten walked freely through her own home. Not as a burden, but as a flame steady, quiet, and finally seen.